Je vous présente Hélène Sanson, qui est conservatrice de la photographie au musée McCord, donc conservatrice des archives photographiques Notman. Elle vous en dira peut-être quelques mots. Et elle va vous présenter à son tour les conférencières. Hein, ce sont quatre conférencières donc, de cet après-midi.
Alors, bon après-midi, puis merci beaucoup à Vincent de m'avoir invité. Et c'est pour moi un honneur de présenter les brillantes conférencières que nous aurons cet après-midi. Mais je profite de cette occasion que j'ai de dire un mot justement sur les archives photographiques Notman, c'est-à-dire de vous dire qu'on a à Montréal une formidable collection de photographies du 19e siècle et du 20e siècle qui est vraiment, pour lesquelles on s'efforce de la rendre ouverte au public, aux chercheurs, aux étudiants. C'est une collection de photographies qui détient les archives du studio de William Notman, un des plus importants photographes en Amérique du Nord au 19e siècle, mais qui a aussi des centaines de milliers de photographies qui représentent les autres photographes canadiens et puis les sujets de l'histoire canadienne. Alors, c'est comme je vous disais, ces archives ou cette collection est ouverte au public par le Centre de documentation. Et nous avons aussi plus de 70 000 photographies qui sont numérisées et accessibles sur le site web du musée McCord. Et alors, c'est vraiment un bienvenu aux chercheurs et aux étudiants et aux historiens, aux écrivains, aux cinéastes, à tout le monde. Alors, j'ai quitté mes archives pour venir entendre avec vous ces conférences cet après-midi. Et la première est par Mme Sharon Sliwinski de l'Université of Western Ontario à London, en Ontario. Sharon Sliwinski is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies and the Center for Theory and Criticism at the University of Western Ontario. Elle est spécialisée en critique théorique de la culture visuelle et en psychanalyse. Sharon Sliwinski est l'auteur d'un ouvrage qui paraîtra en 2012 aux presses de l'Université de Chicago, Human Rights in Camera, et elle travaille actuellement à un nouveau projet qui pourrait s'intituler Dreams Matters et qui porte sur les enjeux sociopolitiques du rêve. Et sa conférence aujourd'hui, Air War and Photography. Je vais momentanément me rasseoir en avant pour pouvoir profiter des images de cette conférence et je reviendrai.
Thank you. I just, for some reason, I feel the need to preface this with the fact that I'm not an art historian, and I come at photographs quite differently, I suppose. And also, the other thing I wanted to say was that Robert this morning had this great sort of toss-away phrase, which was something like, we can't expect fashion models to save the world. And my paper will say that that's not true. Okay. There is something unreal about this air war over Britain, Edward R. Murrow remarks in one of his radio broadcasts during the early days of the London Blitz. Much of it you can't see, but the aircraft are up there in the clouds out of sight. This struggle to convey experience that is passed beyond human scale is one of the hallmarks of Murrow's work from this period. A month into the nightly bombings, for instance, he describes the freakish nature of the damage inflicted by the unseen German planes. He says, "A bomb may explode at an intersection and the blast will travel down 2 streets, shattering windows for a considerable distance, while the big windows within a few yards of the bomb crater remain intact." He adds in a neutral tone that the glass generally falls into the street rather than be blown inwards. One of his broadcasts is delivered from the mouth of an air raid shelter near Trafalgar Square, while sirens wail in the background, and I thought I'd just give you a small clip.
This is Trafalgar Square. The noise that you hear at the moment is the sound of the air raid sirens. I'm standing here just on the steps of St. Martin's in the Fields. A searchlight just burst into action off in the distance, one single beam sweeping the sky above me now. People were walking along quite...
Another of his broadcasts is given in whispered tones because 3 or 4 people are sleeping on mattresses in the floor of his studio. The American journalist mesmerized radio listeners back home with his detailed daily accounts of the war being waged across the Atlantic. The broadcast did not simply offer headline news to American audiences, but rather attempted to convey what life felt like in the city under siege. The unassuming bravery of ordinary citizens, new pressures brought by the war measures, the eerie silence left in the streets after the evacuation of the children, the way the British class system found a new venue of expression in the nightlife of bomb shelters. But as the Blitz stretched into weeks and then into months, Moreau became more and more preoccupied with imparting what he called the war's unreality. The air war pushed the broadcaster's canny powers of description to the limit. On September 20th, 1940, he delivered one of his most surreal accounts. As usual, the radio program was delivered in the middle of the night, in this case at 3:30 in the morning. I'll read to you, it's quite a long quotation. "The scale of this air war is so great, the reporting of it is not easy. We've read to you the communiques and tried to give you an honest estimate of the wounds inflicted upon this, the best bombing target in the world. But the business of living and working in the city is very personal. The little incidents, the things the mind retains, are in themselves unimportant, but they somehow weld together to form a hard core of memories that will remain when the last all clear has sounded. That's why I want to talk for just 3 or 4 minutes about the things we haven't talked about before. For many of these impressions, it is necessary to reach back through only one long week. One night I stood in front of a smashed grocery store and heard dripping inside. It was the only sound in all of London. 2 cans of peaches had been drilled clean through by flying glass, and the juice was dripping onto the floor. There was a flower shop in the East End. Nearly every other building in the block had been smashed. There was a funeral wreath in the window of this shop. Price, 3 shillings and 6 pence, less than $1. In front of Buckingham Palace, there's a bed of red and white flowers, untouched, the reddest flowers I've ever seen. It's difficult to grasp the extraordinariness of these eventide impressions. After months of straightforward coverage, the most potent means to convey the unreality of the Blitz arrived in the sound of dripping peach juice, the sight of a funeral wreath, and mesmerizingly red flowers. Perhaps the best that can be said of this strange composite picture of London circa September 1940 is that after weeks of terrifying night raids, Moreau found himself in the middle of a dream. The Americans' determined attempt to grasp, indeed to picture, that which was occurring around him makes these radio broadcasts one of the more remarkable records of the civilian experience of air war. They testify to one of the most disquieting ideas to emerge during this period of human history, the belief that the most effective way of waging war involved the obliteration of civilian life through air attack. Although this dream of total war has existed for centuries, this particular doctrine took on new potency in the 1930s with the development of aerial bombardment technology. As the Italian theorist of air power Giuliano Duhet realized as early as 1921, aeroplanes would utterly transform the future of war by transforming the location of the front. The invention of air war effectively erased the distinction between soldiers and civilians. He says, "Nothing man can do on the surface of the earth can interfere with a plane in flight, moving freely in the 3rd dimension." And of life on the ground, Walter Benjamin lamented, "A generation that had gone to school in a horse-drawn carriage now stood under the open sky in a landscape where nothing remained unchanged but the clouds, and beneath those clouds, in the field of force of destructive torrents and explosions, the tiny, human, fragile body." The new terrors from above also had a devastating effect on the field of the aesthetic. As the title of my paper, it pays homage to W.G. Sebald's Zurich lectures, Air War and Literature. Sebald's topic is the perplexing silence surrounding the destruction of German cities in the latter half of the Second World War. Some 600,000 German civilians were killed by Allied air raids, 10 times that of British civilian casualties, and some 7.5 million people were left homeless. German cities themselves suffered unparalleled destruction, and yet, as Sebald notes, there was a tacit agreement equally binding on everyone that the true state of material and moral ruin in which the country found itself was not to be described. The destruction of the German cities, a destruction that was experienced by the great majority of the population, remained, Sebald marvels, under a kind of taboo, like a shameful family secret, a secret that perhaps could not even be privately acknowledged. The natural history of destruction wrought from above was therefore both unimaginable and unspeakable. Air war transfigured the dimension of the battlefield and simultaneously shattered the human capacity to communicate. It left its victims bereft of that which seems most inalienable, ruining the securest among our human possessions, the ability to convey experience. The idea of obliterating a civilian population via the third dimension perhaps reached a climax on September 11, 2001, when airplanes themselves became the bomb and the front, when the indiscriminate destruction of civilian life could occur itself up in the clouds out of sight, as Edward Murrow might have said. For as much as 9/11 unfolded as an image, much of this event remained in the domain of the non-representable, and as many have noted, inaugurated a crisis in the notion of the visible itself. The most recent disaster, what has been called the most photographed event in history, has sparked much reflection on the relation between air war and the visible, and specifically that most vexed means of producing and reproducing the visible domain, namely photography. Here is my gambit. If storytelling is among the collateral damage of air war, as Sebald and Benjamin observe, if this new form of technological violence destroyed the traditional forms and networks for sharing human experience, all was not lost. For in the hands of some, the photographic camera can become a kind of stylus for writing what could not be written otherwise. In this era of air war, photography became a potent tool of communication and to communicate these new landscapes of emotional life, the new states of mind created by this terrible force that targeted civilian life and yet effectively remained out of sight. Indeed, against air war's unprecedented innovation in the very forms of imagining and enacting terror, photography came to serve as one of the civilians' best defenses. Modern air war was first found its substantial expression when Germany's Luftwaffe Condor Legion bombed a small Basque town in northern Spain late in the day on April 26, 1937. The market town of Guernica provided a prime target for Germany to test out its new air war capabilities. In addition to the incendiary bombs that ravaged the town center, machine guns took fleeing civilians as their target. News of the attack reached international audiences almost immediately. The Times carried a front-page report by George Steer the next day on April 27th, and photographers were immediately dispatched to capture images of the destruction. By April 28th, photographs of dead women and children were published in the communist paper La Humanité. By April 30th, the first photographs of the bombed-out town appeared in a variety of Parisian papers, including Le Figaro and Ce Soir, which Pablo Picasso was known to have read. His first sketches for his now famous mural date from May 1st. In an anti-war essay written during the same period, Virginia Woolf describes receiving a package of pictures in the Morning's Post. She reports that one photograph shows dead children. Another shows a section of a house. A bomb is torn open the side. There's still a bird cage hanging in what is presumably the sitting room, but the rest of the house looks like so much but a bunch of spillikins suspended in midair. When Woolf looks at these pictures, her feelings become unequivocal. Some fusion takes place within us. However different the education, the traditions behind us, our sensations are the same. The same words rise to our lips. War is an abomination, a barbarity. War must be stopped. One could read these photographic encounters as examples of what Rancière calls scenes of dissensus, that is, new organizations of the sensible world that reconfigure the landscape of what can be seen and thought. If this new invention of air war wreaked damage from the third dimension, photography was called to combat this violence through its networks of distribution, its capacity to generate an international alignment of witnesses. There is much to be said, in other words, about the relation between the new sensory violence wrought from above and photography's ability to help weave a new aesthetic community, or sensus communis, as Kant would say, from below. But beyond the journalistic exposé, photography also served as a special instrument for describing the inward effect of this outward destruction. And in this respect, Ed Murrow was not alone in his presentation of the London Blitz as a dreamscape. Here is where the fashion model shows up. Photographer, surrealist muse, and former Vogue cover girl Lee Miller similarly turned up in London on the eve of this People's War, and she too was captured by the city's unreal reality. In August 1940, during a raid on Thames Haven, the German Luftwaffe accidentally strayed into the northeast end of London. dropping bombs on Tottenham and Finchley, among other boroughs, and the British retaliated by sending a squadron of bombers to Berlin the following night. Incensed, Hitler immediately authorized an all-out assault on the British capital. Beginning September 6, 1940, London was then bombed for 76 consecutive nights. By the end of May 1941, some 43,000 civilians, half of them Londoners, had been killed in this longest city siege in modern times. As an American, Miller was prevented from joining the thousands of women who enlisted in the auxiliary forces, so she kept busy by working as a staff photographer for British Vogue. Already an established and successful commercial photographer, the Blitz returned Miller to her surrealist sensibilities. On her daily trek between her home near Hampstead Heath and the magazine's downtown Bond Street offices, Miller recorded the most arresting sights exposed by the night's air raids. Her pictures, like Moreau's reports, arrange and rearrange the city scenes like so much dream furniture. Some of Miller's images found their way into the public sphere in 1941 when, together with several dozen other British press photographers, they appeared in a small book called Grim Glory, Pictures of Britain Under Fire. It was published in the US under a slightly different title. It was designed to complement Moreau's broadcasts, and the book was a deliberate propaganda effort aimed at shifting US sentiment towards intervention. It didn't work, of course. It took Pearl Harbor for the Americans to enter the war. As the publishers write in their foreword, the book is, quote, the expression of a feeling. Specifically, it attempts to convey the heroic, exasperated, resolute, muddle-headed, defiant, insensitive, in a word English, behavior of ordinary people under the most prolonged intensive battering ever inflicted on civilians. But like Moreau's radio broadcasts, Miller's contributions to this book are more preoccupied with conveying the surprising unreality of the bombings. This is to say, her pictures are less interested in transmitting a heroic English mentality than in portraying the uncanny laws of blast. Perhaps because of their outsider status, both were Americans. Miller and Moreau remained relatively abreast of the widespread efforts to manufacture a national English consciousness. Like the dreamer who wakes from the foreign territory of their dream, both Miller and Moreau occupy the position of interpreter, transcribing this strange social reality they found themselves immersed in. Miller's pictures dominate a section of Grim Glory called The Ironies of War. There is a brief textual introduction. If all that one saw was unrelieved tragedy, life would be unendurable in these besieged cities. Fortunately, the wanton behavior of explosives and blast occasionally produce effects that are ironical, freakish, and beautiful, and sometimes even funny, although the irony is grim and the humor threaded through with pathos. The dozen or so pictures in this section mobilize all the literary tricks and add something more. Miller has a gifted eye for capturing composites. Indeed, she manages to arm herself with all the techniques of dreamwork: displacement, condensation, representation, and secondary revision. Through her lens, for instance, a half-blown up building in Knightsbridge becomes a double of the Venetian Bridge of Sighs. One can almost imagine floating along the Rio de Palazzo in a gondola under this famous arch. Next, Miller pictures a church spewing bricks from its innards. With an inspired use of captioning, she turns the menacing site into a nonconformist chapel, and suddenly the ruins are transformed into an organized agitation for religious freedom, a principled refusal of the tenets of the old church. On the same roll of film, Miller pulls back to capture a long shot of the same scene. Here her caption reads like one of Julia Child's recipes: add one bomb to one nonconformist chapel and you get a Greek temple. The composition calls for a new thesis about the end of empire, or perhaps the potent survival and return of antiquity, or perhaps the picture simply offers itself up as a site for contemplating the human fascination with ruins. At times, Miller displays a quirky knowledge of art history, as in Baroque made Rococo. In this image, a gentleman in formal dress provides a scale for the massive melted Rococo candelabrum in the window. The man's smile, caught in the instant of its unfolding, offers a mirror for our own reaction, which is to say, the spectator is invited to share this joke. Freud famously argued that the power of humor resides in the way that it economizes affect. While a situation might normally call for the expression of anger or frustration, of pain or terror, a good joke saves on this expenditure of feeling. A criminal is led to the gallows on a Monday morning. As he's led from his cell to trudge slowly past through a line of observers, he nods a greeting. Well, what a lovely beginning to the week. That was a joke. Yeah, I thought about keeping that one in. Humor liberates. It denies the arrows of reality. It refuses to be compelled into suffering, and thereby preserves some measure of dignity. The gravest wounds of the world can become occasions for laughter. Sometimes Miller's humor is more angled, and it's more deliberately angled towards her colleagues' gratification. Before they found their way into this book, Miller hung her pictures on the walls of Vogue's Bond Street offices. One can imagine her playfully inserting one of her contributions among the mock-ups for the winter season. Lampposts are worn cockeyed this year in smart Belgravia. This is Miller's creative dream logic at its best. A delicately twisted lamppost becomes haute couture. In another shot, Miller provides a visual illustration of Sebald and Benjamin's thesis about air war's effects on language. Remington Silent plays in the name of a well-known typewriter used at the time, but here its keys are mute. The pictorial image is called upon to stand in for the traditional means of signifying experience through words. And although photography is itself a silent medium, this image manages to testify to the way storytelling has been crippled by the invention of air war. Beyond simply taking aesthetic pleasure for the artist's eye, in the artist's eye for juxtaposition, this photographic record of the London Blitz perhaps calls for pause. Is it not remarkable that one of the most pivotal and sobering political moments of the last century was best conveyed to distant audiences in terms of a dream? Nazi ideology presumed that their program of terror would compel Londoners to rise up and demand a new government, one which would make peace with Germany, as so much of Europe had done. What can be gleaned from the fact that this people's war, the ordinary citizen's best defense against this brand of psychological terrorism, was dreamwork? Perhaps does this extraordinary fact not beg for new questions about the wellspring of political resistance? Perhaps responsibility and responsiveness are not just to be found in a vigilant sovereign consciousness. Instead, indeed, if fascist regimes seek to aestheticize political life, as Benjamin famously proposed, perhaps Miller's photographs resist this ideology by turning to the estranging horizon of dream life. Perhaps dream represents the singularly durable and resistant aesthetic form, able to hold open the grounds of thought in dark times. One last example. One of Miller's most arresting shots pictures the shattered dome of the main building of the University College. Gauging from her contact sheets, the photographer first attempted to capture the dome directly, so especially the far two in the right top corner. As any one of us might do, she appears to have wandered into the main atrium and angled her camera upwards. But this view does not express any real feeling of the Blitz. It fails to convey the field of force and destructive torrents and explosions, the unreal reality of living in a city that is being destroyed slowly, methodically, night after night. Eventually, Miller turned her attention away from the ceiling, letting her gaze wander downward to the fragile human domain, finally focusing her Rolleiflex twin-lens camera on the floor. Her final image shows a shattered dome in a watery reflection, a kind of visual hallucination, a representation in a manner Benjamin himself might have termed profane illumination. Perhaps here one can see how photography intervenes on air war's destruction of civilian life by re-injecting a devastated landscape with all the salubriousness of dream life. Through such images, spectators can perhaps glimpse what air war seeks to destroy, and simultaneously all that is worth preserving of human life. Thank you.